Good afternoon, everyone. Today's discussion about U.S.-Russia relations and the pursuit of predictability. We are honored to be joined today by Ambassador Alexander Vershbow and Katrina vanden Heuvel. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community that bridges the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. We leverage emerging, established, and entrepreneurial leaders to highlight and drive innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges. For today's topic, we'll be talking about U.S.-Russia relations. Oh, let me see. Yes, President Biden has articulated a policy toward Russia that aims at stability and predictability. He's hardly the first U.S. president to come to power seeking better relations with the United States' former Cold War adversary. Yet it seems that with each presidency since the heady days of the fall of the Soviet Union, an initial reset at the start of an administration ends up in a worse place by the end of the term. Putin is now working with his fourth American president. What can we expect this time around? And are predictability and stability reasonable goals? And what does it take for us to get there? So we are extremely honored to have Ambassador Vershbow, distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and veteran of NATO, and Katrina vanden Heuvel, editor of The Nation and author of Voices of Glasnost, Interviews with Gorbachev's Reformers. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. Ambassador Vershbow, starting with you. The big news this week is Russia ending diplomatic ties with NATO following the organization's expulsion of 8 Russian diplomats, whom NATO asserted were undeclared intelligence officers, from Brussels earlier this month. You took position as the deputy of the US mission to NATO the day after the failed August 1991 coup by communists against Gorbachev. And later you were the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. The NATO question is one that dogs conversations about Russia and the West. The idea that NATO expansion into what Russia sees as its sphere of influence was seen as a threat and poisoned the water of Russia's relationship with the West. You had the great opportunity to witness this expansion from the top ranks of NATO. So what is your assessment of why relations, which were so promising at the beginning of the Bush-Putin period, soured? And what are the implications of Moscow's decision on Tuesday to end ties with NATO?
Okay, well, thank you, Courtney, first of all, and thank you to Network 2020 for this opportunity to discuss the challenges that we face in managing relations with Russia. And of course, everybody agrees relations are about as bad as they've ever been, certainly as they were at the height of the Cold War. Even the modest goal of the Biden administration to make the relationship more stable and predictable, which I of course support, is not an easy goal to achieve. That's because today's Russia has become one of the biggest exporters of instability, and it seems to thrive on being unpredictable in its political and military behavior. And I think this was only reconfirmed by this week's news about the closure of the Russian mission to NATO in Brussels and NATO's counterpart offices in Moscow. Although NATO did strengthen its defense and deterrence posture after Russia's 2014 aggression against Ukraine, allies did pledge at the time to continue dialogue with Russia. The goal was to reduce risks, to increase transparency of military activities, and to prevent military incidents from escalating to the level of military conflict. And as part of this dialogue, NATO tried to continue using the NATO-Russia Council, Somebody's on the line there.
Yeah, I think Katrina, thank you, wonderful.
Okay. We tried to use the NATO-Russia Council, established 19 years ago by NATO leaders and Vladimir Putin, to continue to serve as the anchor of NATO-Russia cooperation. But for the last year and a half, Russia has refused to actually meet in this NATO-Russia Council. It withdrew its military representatives, so the closure of their office is largely symbolic at this point. It doesn't have any practical effect. Their justification that they can't do business without these 8 diplomats is specious. And NATO did agree that they could keep 10, which is more than most nations have if they're not members of NATO, as their representation to NATO. Still, it's not a good thing when a country shuts down channels of communication, making it hard to engage if there's a crisis. So I hope it's not the end of the road for the NATO-Russia Council. But this brings me to your bigger question, the historical question. Was NATO's enlargement the cause of the breakdown in the West's relations with Russia? My short answer is no, hell no. And it's not just because I was involved in the policymaking back in the late 80s and 90s. Certainly NATO is the biggest bogeyman in Russian propaganda these days, but it's worth remembering that for more than 25 years after the end of the Cold War, NATO's goal was to develop a strategic partnership with Russia as an integral part of what we still call a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And this partnership was successful in many respects. It's true the Russians didn't like NATO enlargement, but we were determined at the time to right the wrongs of the 1945 Yalta Agreement and bring the formerly captive nations into the Western family. And there was also, let's remember, a sense of urgency at the time. After the violent breakup of Yugoslavia, there was a sense we had to move fast because violence could erupt in other parts of Europe and even in the Soviet Union itself. But we were determined to transform NATO in a way that drew Russia into a common security system. It's worth remembering that, and you mentioned the 1991 time I arrived at NATO, my first assignment there. In those days, Yeltsin was actually talking about Russia becoming a member of NATO. We were talking the same language on a lot of issues that worth remembering, given how sharp our differences are now with Putin. Yeltsin and Bill Clinton ultimately decided on a 2-track approach. NATO would transform itself into a more political alliance open to new members on the one hand, but we would establish an institutionalized partnership with Russia, which is this NATO-Russia Council that is still at least in business, at least formally speaking. And we even made security guarantees to Russia that NATO wouldn't put nuclear weapons or substantial conventional forces on the territory of new members. So anyway, I won't go into the details, but a lot of good things happened during these 2.5 decades of cooperation. We even had Russian troops operating under NATO command in Bosnia and later in Kosovo. We worked together on counterterrorism after 9/11. And I remember I was in Moscow when the Baltic states joined NATO. It was hardly a hiccup. The Russians, I think, took this in stride because they knew that what had changed in NATO made clear there was no military threat to Russia. So I would say that it was other things, including mistakes by the United States, that soured Putin's views of cooperation with the West. I would put the Iraq War, which, like the intervention in Kosovo, was done without a UN Security Council mandate, was our missile defense programs, which the Russians were convinced was aimed at neutralizing their nuclear deterrent. And there was kind of the attitude that you saw in people like Donald Rumsfeld, who argued that Russia wasn't important anymore. We don't really need to pay any attention to their security concerns. So if there's anything that scared Putin in his early years, it wasn't NATO's enlargement. It was the spread of Western ideas, and in particular, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. This, more than anything, I think, convinced Putin that cooperation with the West brought with it the contagion of democracy. And that not only threatened to loosen Russia's grip on the former Soviet republics, but it brought with it the risks of regime change, which could ultimately threaten the Putin system in Russia itself. So at least up until this point, I think it was Western ideas more than NATO enlargement that scared Putin. But I won't deny that the Bush administration in 2008 made a strategic mistake. It prematurely pushed the idea of Georgian and Ukrainian membership in NATO And it didn't do anything like Clinton did, kind of developing a two-track approach or other initiatives that could assuage Russian concerns. Might have been harder to do when you're talking about Ukraine and Georgia, but we didn't even try. This cost us allied support. It antagonized Putin, led to the war in Georgia, and ultimately to what we're dealing with now in Ukraine. So early NATO enlargement was, I think, the right thing to do, and still is a success story. But mistakes were made in the Bush administration on handling Georgia and Ukraine, which are problems that are still perhaps the most vexing on the agenda.
So if I could jump in.
Absolutely, yes. So yes.
I want to thank Network 2020. I joined you in 2017 for an event. And I'm here really representing the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord, which was relaunched in 2015, designed to dialogue, public awareness regarding the dangers of a new Cold War, encouraging open, civilized, informed debate. And that is what I hope we have. I couldn't disagree more with Ambassador Vershbow. I think—
I get that sometimes.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you do. But I think that the humiliation that NATO expansion bred in Russia was critical in the rise of Putin. At the end of the Cold War, there was an important point made, which was not to be triumphalist. The triumphalism of America, looking at what it thought was a weak Russia on its knees, led to a betrayal of President Mikhail Gorbachev. This is now corroborated out of the National Security Archives. People could go look that Bush and Baker promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward after German reunification. In doing so, it remilitarized a Europe that could have found security in the EU, in other institutions. Remember, it was the Marshall Plan, not NATO military plans, that really put Germany back on its knees. It created a new dividing line in Europe. This is not just me. Go and read Thomas Friedman, who may have changed his mind, but at the beginning of NATO, he believed it was a terrible, grave mistake, as did leading diplomat George Kennan, as did many Democratic senators, as did Paul Nitze. So there was at least a debate in the United States, which there isn't now as NATO moves eastward. I would argue destabilizing our security and remilitarizing, as I said. Gorbachev, who was the most radical nuclear arms reductionist, by the way, the nuclear arms race has also been fueled to a certain extent by NATO, but Gorbachev always believed in a common European home. This was not a vision that could not be achieved in our time, and it was a sphere of common interest from Vladivostok to Lisbon. That has been lost. I think the most important moment in defining Putin was not about democracy. It was looking out at a unipolar world with the United States at the height of the Iraq War, one of the greatest debacles, perhaps the greatest debacle of foreign policy history. At the Munich Security Conference, Putin gave a speech in 2008 where he basically said, this is no longer a unipolar world. The United States was being ravaged in the Middle East and Iraq, and he spoke about a multipolar world. NATO does not allow that idea to come forward with all the talk of Yeltsin joining NATO's council, and Yeltsin was opposed to NATO expansion as well. I think what's happened with the expansion or discussion of expansion to Georgia and Ukraine is disastrous. It has nationalized or internationalized what are civil wars. And Ambassador Vershbow, I imagine at the outset of NATO expansion, the idea of moving to Georgia or Ukraine was considered pretty outre. I mean, that's out there. And I will submit that Article 5, which demands that members of NATO use their forces on behalf of another member, no president's going to do that. So at the heart of NATO is a myth that a president of the United States is going to take US men and women into the outskirts of Georgia or Ukraine. What we need, and I'll stop, is forceful diplomacy to resolve the crisis in Ukraine. Our cover story at The Nation next week is by Anatol Levin of the Quincy Institute. There are diplomatic possibilities, Minsk II, Minsk III, which have been discarded largely because of NATO fantasies. So I just think there is the real possibility of stability and working with Russia. We need to rethink, but I do think there's some concrete ideas. And David Ignatius of the Washington Post, who is not a dove, had a very interesting column people should look at in the Washington Post yesterday about what's happening around cyber rules of the road. So there are areas we can work on. I continue to think NATO works against mutual security and remilitarizes.
Thank you both. I mean, it does sound like, and this could easily be a whole day conference just talking about NATO. So we will move on from this, but it does sound like both the Georgia and Ukraine question is a point of agreement, and that regardless, I think this idea that there was this perceived threat, whether it's from Western values or from NATO, that really got under Russia's skin, and that probably could have been managed better. Moving on from the NATO question, because like I said, we could talk about that all day. Ambassador Vershbow, one concern that arises when talking about the US-Russia relationship is this clash of values, that the United States declared emphasis on human rights and democratic values as anathema to Russia's autocratic system. And as a student of Russian history, which I studied at Columbia and have always enjoyed Russian history, I was often told about the pervasiveness of this idea of the strong hand in Russian politics, and that Russia is predisposed to want the order that comes through more authoritarian rule. Based on your years of experience working with the country, how do you respond to that assertion?
Okay, thanks very much for the question. Let me just do 30 seconds on the NATO question. I certainly didn't feel triumphalist when I was involved back in the late 80s and early 90s. I was director of Soviet affairs when the Gorbachev phenomenon was coming into full flower, and we really felt that we had an enormous opportunity, and I think we did a lot to seize that. And I was very much involved in the negotiations, working with Madeleine Albright and Strobe Talbot, in negotiations with Primakov and other Russian officials. And again, they may not have liked NATO enlargement. I think that this narrative of humiliation was not really present at that time. Now, maybe there were other mistakes made which soured Putin on the West. And as I said before, I would list the Iraq War as number one in the general attitude that Russia is not our equal anymore, as having contributed to this. But Ukraine and Georgia is a vexing question because their security is now very much at risk. NATO membership for these countries is not on the immediate horizon, even if we could snap our fingers and make it happen. And Katrina may be right that there's going to be a serious debate if we ever get to that point about whether it is worth putting American lives on the line to defend Ukraine and to defend Georgia. I'm sympathetic towards their cause. I think they're as worth defending as Kuwait was back in 1991, but obviously we're dealing with a nuclear superpower, not just with Saddam Hussein. Anyway, enough on that. I don't want this whole thing to be about NATO enlargement. On the values issue, it's certainly true today that Putin does feel threatened by the spread of Western democratic values, as I mentioned. He certainly resents it when the United States raises human rights cases like the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, or when we question the legitimacy of the recent parliamentary elections in Russia. Putin likes to accuse us of double standards, and Russian propaganda tries to discredit US democracy as much as it can, and we certainly have been giving them a lot of ammunition in the last couple of years. But I think my experience is we have to be very realistic about our ability to change Russian domestic politics. There's times when we cannot remain silent, and the Congress and public opinion will punish any administration if it appears to be indifferent to serious human rights violations in Russia or anywhere else. Although Russia gets special attention because it claims to be a Western, a European democracy, even though it's farther and farther away from that paradigm. But if we ignore human rights, we run the risk that Congress will tie the hands of any administration. We saw this in the Cold War with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was well intended and it did create some leverage to increase Jewish emigration. But Jewish emigration ceased to be a problem, and Jackson-Vanik stayed in effect for another decade and a half. So we need to strike the right balance, find a way of being true to our principles, supporting democratic forces and civil society, at least morally, if not materially, but not to do so at the expense of cooperation in areas like arms control or the war on terrorism, where our own security is very much at stake, and where what used to be called linkage politics could be counterproductive to our own security. On the strong hand thing, it's certainly true that there are very few periods of democracy in Russian history, but I feel we should always reject the notion that the Russian people are genetically encoded to prefer living under an authoritarian system, or that they're not capable of building democracy and the rule of law, or that they have some psychological need to be coddled by a dictatorial strong hand. History isn't destiny. As Katrina mentioned, we saw in the 80s and 90s the emergence of a genuine movement for democracy and freedom in Russia, in which the dissidents that I used to meet when I was a junior diplomat in the late 70s in the embassy in Moscow, they suddenly came out of the shadows to become part of the political mainstream. And we saw the appearance of hundreds of NGOs and independent journalists. A real democratic culture began to take root. And it was all the more remarkable that the biggest impulse for reform and democratization came from within the ranks of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And this battle was still going on when I was ambassador from 2001 to 2005 in the early Putin years. There was still a campaign to try to protect independent media. NGOs were still flourishing. We had assistance programs through USAID to help NGOs, figure out how to organize themselves and fundraise and carry out their programs. I took a lot of flack for being sort of speaking out for democracy and for values when things began to go south under Putin. But I think at the time we kind of owed it to the Russian people who are still fighting for their freedom to show that we were still with them, even though it became clear, even in my first year there, that Putin did not buy into Western values, and those who formed his power base, the so-called siloviki, the people from the security services and the military, definitely mistrusted any form of democracy and believed their own propaganda that the West was using assistance programs and its own rhetorical support for democracy to undermine the Putin system and weaken Russia and deprive it of its role on world stage.
Could I jump in? I'm sorry. My bad talk show background. I'm going to do
let me just finish by saying, we do have to deal with the current Russian regime as it is, but we shouldn't be fatalistic that democracy can't rise again in Russia. This was a choice by Putin and the Siloviki, and it's become a very decisive choice away from freedom. But a future leader may make a different choice, and the stagnation and the disillusionment that you see in the opinion polls could lead to change happening sooner rather than later. And I think we have to find ways without jeopardizing progress on arms control to support those forces, prepare for a better future for Russia.
So if I might jump in, I would take issue, Ambassador, with the large frame, which is, I think Gorbachev opened the door to democratization, and it required Russians to come through, but it was halted. I think de-democratization de-democratization began with Yeltsin. The looting of Russia, the fire sale of Russia's assets, the creation of the oligarchical class ravaged Russia. Poverty was 85% when Putin came to power. The first act of Putin's in power was to give Yeltsin's family immunity. He was selected. This is documented in Russian literature. They looked at Stepashin, a former KGB guy. They looked at others who could secure Russia. Putin was the right-hand person to a democratic reformer, the mayor of St. Petersburg, Sobchak. In any case, the firing on an elected parliament in 1993, these were acts of de-democratization and the creation of extraordinary inequality. I'm not an ambassador. I've been reporting from Russia for 40 years and have seen a lot. And one thing is, I would take issue with some of the reporting today. I spoke to Courtney about this. I think it's been easier to demonize Putin than to offer analysis of the forces inside Russia. There is a civil society. There are climate activists. There are still syndicates of media around the country. A friend of mine just won the Nobel Peace Prize, Dmitry Muratov, Novaya Gazeta. Yeah, you can criticize that it still exists, as do other media, but his paper was just part of the Pandora's project, looking at some of the deepest corruption. He, before Navalny, his paper showed Putin's abuses of power and corruption. I have worked with civil society groups, and I still do, feminist groups, others. And what you see is a larger trend that when there is Cold War, the space for dissent, the space for speaking out and not being called a foreign agent, which is insidious and toxic, narrows. The war parties are empowered in both countries. And I think there is still room. I am not fatalistic. There is still room for selective cooperation, as I think it used to be called, dual track. The security piece is critical, and how we rouse a new generation in this country to understand that is something I think a lot about. Former Clinton Defense Secretary William Perry has been a prophet on this issue. He says we're sleepwalking into nuclear arms disasters. So I think we need to go back and reweave the arms control regime. The abrogation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002 by John Bolton and George W. was the beginning of the unraveling. It wasn't on the Russian side. Putin is a soft authoritarian. And what is happening around these Cold War issues and the COVID, kind of mentality breeds more of that attitude. But I do think we have a lot of work to do in this country, don't you think, Ambassador? Before we go out abroad to kind of lecture others. I think the most what leads to real change, democratic change in countries, is when it's not imposed from outside, but it's built by, say, Novaya Gazeta, by those who around the country who understand they're fighting for their own change as best they can. So I think we need to create space and solidarity, but not lecturing. I think that is counterproductive. And I'm not an isolationist. I believe in the treaties we need to reweave, but I do believe we would do better to rebuild our house. We have a lot of issues.
Thank you,
I don't
Katrina.
disagree with all that. First, your point that there's still a few elements of civil society, including NGOs, including Novaya Gazeta. Echo Moskvy is still broadcasting, which we obviously hope they can survive. At the same time, we can't deny the fact that there's been the most systematic suppression of opposition, particularly in the run-up to the recent parliamentary elections that we've seen, and this whole foreign agent and extremist law is getting out of control. But I agree, lecturing the Russians isn't going to change this. It's finding ways, despite all the obstacles and roadblocks that Putin puts up, to continue to connect with the Russian successor generation, get more students to come to the US, at least be exposed.
Well, could I say one word about that?
Not be
the
victims.
Importance of exchanges, Ambassador, I think we could agree on the rebuilding of the capacity of embassies and consulates And the work of exchanges, which I think has been understated and underrated, was part of a beginning of a Cold War where you did have dialogue. And that shutting down is kind of almost criminalizing diplomacy at this moment, that we don't have these exchanges. And it's certainly Russia bears blame in not allowing native Russians to work in the embassy. But I think on this side, there is a kind of clamping down on diplomacy, which is unhelpful.
Just to interject, because there are a lot of views, and we're getting to be about the point where I want to turn to the Q&A box. I would just like to stay on this last point about diplomacy, because I think it is a very critical one, because I think, as both of you have stated, the diplomacy piece is really important. Just so the audience knows, I mean, we've gone from US presence at the Russian embassy of a high of 350 Americans and 1,900 locally employed staff down to just 150 Americans, no locally employed staff. So all of these initiatives that we're talking about, whether it's this people-to-people diplomacy, and I know, Russia canceled this high school student exchange program when I was a diplomat, and that was one of the biggest, most robust programs. All of these initiatives require diplomacy. And so how do we work in the absence of that? So how do we create positive engagement, whether it's on cyber, whether it's on nuclear or arms control, whether it's on things like people-to-people exchanges, absent that? And I'll start with you, Katrina, and then I'll turn to you, Ambassador Vershbow.
My understanding, though, Ambassador Vershbow would know more, is that coming out of Geneva, and I'm not thinking of 1985, but of the Biden-Putin summit, that there are various groups working in areas of common interest, whether it's in terms of terrorism, drug interdiction. One hopes stability in Central Asia. Again, here, I think there was a little bit of media misunderstanding that Xi and Putin were clinking glasses after the Taliban came to power, because they're going to deal with terrorist drug threats. I think the cyber piece and the nuclear piece, you can see there's some movement, some ability to find rules of the road, which is imperative. So I think it's going to require putting aside certain areas. It's not new, dual track, selective cooperation. I do think there needs to be a new mindset, and there's an opportunity post-Trump to think anew about relationships with the world. So much was poisoned. If Trump was for it, in my mind, Trump became Putin and Putin became Trump. So this narrative of foreign interference, by the way, which has become a real danger in Russia, is also one in this country. And I think we need to break that in order to think about security, about national interest, and be realistic. Not utopian, be realistic about what is achievable through diplomacy, dialogue, and all of what we try at the American Committee for East-West US-Russia Accord to drive.
Ambassador Vershbow, what are your thoughts on how we do diplomacy?
Yeah, I think, again, I agree with a lot of the points that Katrina just made. We certainly have to be realistic about what we can achieve in the short term, because I think the resistance to a more stable and predictable relationship is very strong on the Russian side, and I think it's useful sometimes for Putin to keep this enemy image of a Russophobic West encircling Russia, the besieged fortress that they often talk about in their own propaganda. It's kind of easier to demonize the West than to make some hard choices in diplomacy. But I think the Biden administration is taking a good approach. On the one hand, being realistic about the nature of our adversary. We call them a worthy adversary, but they're still an adversary. And resisting aggressive behavior when we have to, whether it's continuing to bolster NATO's deterrence capabilities, whether it's supporting Ukrainian armed forces, not to encourage another war, but to help them deter the Russians who are postured for new offensives on very short warning. But at the same time, to engage diplomatically where we can to stabilize the relationship including arms control. There's the strategic stability dialogue, which hopefully will try to set an agenda for the next phase of arms control, which needs to get into non-strategic weapons, new technologies like hypersonics, and other exotica that Putin is excited about, and try to kind of reduce the dynamics of a new arms race, which is beginning to emerge. Even on Ukraine, there's not going to be a military solution, at least not by the Ukrainians. The Russians may think there's a military solution for them, and we have to dissuade them of that fact. But the key is to support diplomacy. I was glad to see that my old colleague, Victoria Nuland, was able to engage with the Kremlin decision makers on this, not just with the foreign ministry during her last visit, to try to see whether a fair solution can be developed that will get the Russian troops out of eastern Ukraine and allow at least that piece of Ukraine to be reintegrated into the larger country. There's a lot of other issues where we may be able to achieve at least limited results or diffuse tensions, such as on the Central Asia post-Afghanistan, cyber. At least initial signs from this discussion in Geneva, I think, are a little bit hopeful, but the Russians still aren't owning up to the ransomware attacks, or at least their responsibility to crack down on these criminal networks that are carrying them out. But Biden himself said, we won't get immediate results. We need to kind of watch how the Russians' behavior evolves over the coming months to determine whether the spirit of Geneva is real or whether there is little change in Russian behavior. But I think the Biden administration has the right approach, and they are engaging. This issue of diplomatic platforms and having the structures to conduct diplomacy is a real problem. And the Russians, I think they're overplaying their hand in throwing out the local employees, which means that Russians can't get visas because we're very dependent on local employees for that. It'll take at least a year to staff up the embassy with Americans. So it was just a spiteful move on the Russians' part, but it's leading to a tit for tat process, which will just make it worse, not better.
On areas of cooperation, just turning to the Q&A box, there's one just to follow up on this from Claude Buechner, who asks, speaking of strategic partnership, is there an opportunity to work with Russian Gazprom and even the Chinese in the urgent need to sequester the methane hydrate that is leaking under the Arctic Sea? This could reframe the relationship as a partnership to address the underappreciated threats to our common future. Katrina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Acura is going to convene a panel next week on the eve of COP 26, looking at climate crisis, the Arctic, and areas of collaboration between the United States, Russia, and to some extent, China. It is the case that China is the big player in this issue of climate. Russia's, it's interesting, the question, because so much attention has been paid on, I think, a misperception of how Gazprom is holding Europe hostage. It needs to be reframed, but I don't know enough about methane. But there's no question that Russia and China need to be part of some climate agreement. And I think that is an area where there are possibilities.
And Ambassador Vershbow, is that something that you have any experience with?
I don't have much direct experience, but certainly this methane cloud, just what I've seen in terms of the maps is quite scary. And so we should see whether there's a way to deal with this in partnership with the Russians. I don't know if there's technological issues in terms of sharing our technology that might help the Russians get a lid on this thing sooner rather than later. But it could be a relatively non-contentious area for collaboration on climate change. I agree with the broader point that Russia, while it may in the short term not be as big an emitter as China, but it's facing huge challenges of its own with the melting permafrost. And so that too is a reason to at least try to engage them on ways to mitigate these effects, even if we have our differences over Gazprom and pipelines and all that.
Great, thank you. I had a question that I wanted to ask you earlier, Katrina, that is actually tying in nicely with some questions in the Q&A box, and that's about some of the different nuances of the strands in Russian society that we in the US may sometimes miss when we focus, like you say, so much on Putin. And just to give a little bit more shade to that, we have a question from Kyle Marston in the Q&A box who's asking about the declining population. And so I'd love to just frame my question in the form of demographics. So both what's happening demographically with the population in Russia and looking at the next generation. Are there any like broad themes that you see emerging from the people that you've talked to?
Well, in terms of, just the raw demographics, there was a scholar, Murray Feshbach, who did a lot of work years ago. There's been a crisis of certainly male mortality rates. And the regime has gone back and forth in terms of giving awards to mothers, if you have more children. But I think what we're witnessing now with the COVID crisis in Russia, which is deeper than we know, which happens not only in Russia, but in countries where there's not enough transparency, is you're witnessing again this decline in mortality rates, especially among men. And it's because of drinking, smoking, and vices. But I was struck that the recent reports don't include something that has to be factored in. World War II, it still plays a role in Russia, which lost 26.5 million people, including civilians. But that lingers in terms of absence of men in the demographics. When I was in Russia, my 20-year-old friends had children at age 20 and one child, and it wasn't imposed like in China. But now people are having more children if the economy is getting better, but there is still a crisis which the government pays attention to. That said, there are a lot of younger people you see in the demonstrations and the protests, and not just in Moscow. But what struck me was in the regional capitals a few years ago, like Vladivostok and Novosibirsk, you had younger and younger people, not only in the streets, but then running for office and taking a risk. So I think there's a new generation, but they do face great stresses. And there is an attempt on the part of the government to kind of increase the birth rate. And the church plays a big role in that too. The Orthodox Church, which is a very powerful institution in Russia. And I don't think you can study Russia today without understanding the power, property, and influence of the Orthodox Church.
Thank you. This next question, we've actually have a few variations on it, and I will start with you, Ambassador Vershbow, and then Katrina, I would love to hear your thoughts on it as well. So I'll take Jerry Marcus's question, but this is coming up a couple of times. So Jerry Marcus asks, NPR reported this morning that there is strong suspicion going back to 2014 that the Havana Syndrome cases that started affecting many US intelligence officers and diplomats is being caused by the Russians using targeted microwaves. So he asked, obviously the use of this type of weaponry is extremely difficult to prove as it is portable and leaves no physical evidence. And is this type of program being done by the US and others? If not, why not? How should the US respond? So looking at this new type of aggressive behavior, can it be traced to Russia? How should the US respond? Ambassador Vershbow, and then Katrina, I'll take your answer.
Yeah, I don't know anything from, in terms of inside information or classified information on this, but I remember I was a junior diplomat in Moscow in the late 70s when the first microwaves were detected beaming at the embassy, but in those days, we never quite figured out why they were being beamed at us. Nobody seemed to have any ill effects health-wise. They may have been powering listening devices in some way. But this latest Havana Syndrome is very serious. I've talked to people who have seen some of the reporting inside the government, and it's earlier theories that it was mass psychosis are being rejected, that there are real harmful effects being experienced by people. And it's not, I think, accidental that it's been concentrated in Vienna, where we have large diplomatic presence for the International Atomic Energy Agency, the OSCE, other international institutions. So it could be, if the Russians are suspect, that is at least circumstantial evidence pointing in their direction. Clearly, if the Russians are determined to be the perpetrators, this will be devastating, explosive in relations with Russia. And I assume CIA Director Burns is going to amass real evidence before we make any accusations. But it's quite a serious matter. What I've read about the symptoms is pretty scary in terms of actual brain damage being done this way. I'm not aware that the U.S. has got similar programs underway. Certainly hope not.
We've had a reporter on this story for about 2 years, someone who specializes in Cuba. I don't know if I'd call it the Havana Syndrome anymore, because it's now spread, as Ambassador Vershbow said, to Vienna and other capitals. It is the case, in our article, we go back to Moscow in the 70s and the beaming of the US Embassy. But at this point, I think there's, the FBI was down in Havana several times working with the Cubans. The Cubans have put out a report saying they don't know what's going on. I do think that the State Department now is on the hot seat, right? I mean, because there's been back and forth, not taking it seriously enough. State Department officials have become very angry, and it's a kind of cohort seeking, reparations and justice. There is also the view that it was crickets. There's also the view it was psychosis, as the ambassador said. I don't think we know. And even if it turns out to be Russia, the question always with Russia and even in our country is accountability. I mean, it's hard to believe that Putin doesn't know, but there are rogue operations which may have gotten out of control. But we need more evidence, and we certainly need in the interim to take care of those who've suffered from the beaming as of now. And I think we're going to learn more, because it's become a kind of lobby constituency within the state.
And just to follow up on that and take it to a larger level, we have a question from Joanna Waszewski, who asks, does the government of Russia not undermine its desire to be treated as a great power when it uses social media and cyber attacks to influence European elections and poisons its opponents? So Katrina, if I know we tend to come back to the government question, it's sort of on people's minds, but I'd love to hear your response to that.
Let me take there's cyber attack was in that question, wasn't it? I mean, also social media interference. This is not to excuse by any measure, but I also think we need to look at home first before we go out. This country has had a long history of interference in elections. This country was the first to wage a really very dangerous cyber attack it was called Stuxnet, maybe there was something prior, in Iran. So I think we need to be careful about demonizing, not to deny or excuse, but to say that we are above, because we too, as a great power, have participated. I do think it's different when it's a soft authoritarian country, though one could argue we were moving in that direction in the prior administration and may still be moving in that direction. We don't know, we have to be vigilant about our own freedoms. But the question of interference, I'm not going to get into Russiagate. I think there was Russian interference. I think it was radically overstated. I think it became an excuse for a lot of what is pathological and dangerous about our own country, and allowed us not to pay attention to dark money and corruption. And the danger of Russiagate was that it allowed for so much attention to that, we lost sight of some other issues. And it also led to, I think, a very dangerous security framework, because if Putin was the demon, how do you do arms control? So I think we need to return to, soft authoritarian and selective, and not praising, but finding a way to work together on issues that are of security and other purposes.
Thank you, Katrina. Before I turn to my next question, I just wanted to pick up on what Katrina just said about arms control. And Ambassador Vershbow, I think that this is a pretty critical issue. It's one that has had a lot of ups and downs even over the past year. What are your thoughts on where we are with arms control with Russia? Where do you see things going? What are your biggest concerns?
Well, just first, briefly on cyber, I generally agree with Katrina there that disinformation is more of a domestic challenge. We did tend to ascribe more influence to the Russians than I think was appropriate. And I think the main challenge there is, first for the platforms themselves to figure out how to establish better standards and enforce those. But also, we just generally have to reduce our vulnerability so that the Russians don't see an advantage in trying to target us through social media. That's a challenge of education as much as a technical challenge. Cyber is a complex issue because Stuxnet, was indeed, I think, a legitimate use of cyber weaponry to prevent progress in the Iranian nuclear program. You can debate whether it's deterring them or only emboldening them, but that's why cyber requires some kind of arms control approach where we have a mutual deterrence and rules of the road rather than sort of expecting to banish activities which governments on both sides are going to consider to be legitimate. But on arms control, there's a huge agenda that's growing because about the only agreement left is the New START treaty. It's good that the Biden administration extended that in the first days of the administration before it expired. And it would have got to go back to the Senate, which had a tough time at ratifying anything. But there's so many new dimensions to the arms race that are beginning to emerge. And I'm worried that there's a huge asymmetry right now in the modernization cycles. The Russians have been spending a fortune on all kinds of new offensive systems, sea-based, land-based, air-based, hypersonic warheads, nuclear-powered cruise missiles that can orbit the Earth several times and then drop a bomb. And they may feel that they have an upper hand, however short-sighted that is, and maybe unwilling to negotiate. So I hope these strategic stability talks that have started can overcome some of their tendency to play hard to get, and that we can find a way to get non-strategic nuclear weapons, which are the biggest pool of nukes that need to be brought under constraint. Maybe in parallel, think of some ways to increase predictability about missile defense, which can encourage both sides to build up their offenses in order to overwhelm the defenses. And then on cyber, to use some ongoing bilateral and UN talks to at least begin to establish some rules of the road, recognizing that you can't count on countries to honor them in the breach. And an added problem is sort of what I would call the mendacity of Russian spokespeople. They deny that they have troops in eastern Ukraine. They deny any responsibility for ransomware. We have to get past that because you can't really negotiate agreements with somebody who's lying to you.
Could I say, Ambassador Vershbow, I would come away seeking the beginnings of a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. I think that is imperative. That it could blow up in very dangerous ways.
No, I've written a lot about that, how we need to internationalize it under international administration, international peacekeepers to basically get the Ukrainians out and Russians out, and have a 5-year cooling off period.
And there'd be a pluralistic plan according to one of the Minsk agreements. But I was going to say, we are modernizing, quote, modernizing our nuclear arsenal. And we already are like 10 steps above Russia and China. China's involved, obviously, too. I just think that this COVID moment, it's not gone, it's not past, should give us the impetus to rethink security, to really rethink security, because all these nukes aren't going to help fight pandemics. So what is human security? Again, this is something Gorbachev spoke very compellingly about, to reimagine, because we're going to need resources for climate, for pandemics, and the nuclear arsenals, I fear, are building up several corporations, and not doing, we have enough, let's put it that way. I'm not going to become my great colleague, Jonathan Schell, who was an abolitionist, as was Henry Kissinger, right? Saakashvili, and none. But there is a sense that we have enough and that we should rethink how to build down, not build up. And by the way, the Russians played a very important role on the Iran nuclear deal. That, to me, along with our policy toward Cuba, befuddles me when I look at the Biden administration. I mean, that to me is a no-brainer to re-engage for the security of the region. Anyway.
I think that's happened.
Yes, Ambassador Vershbow.
I think U.S. is trying to get Russian assistance to bring the Iranians back into the agreement. The Europeans may have the lead, but the Russians are showing at least some responsiveness.
So that's
good to know. We probably have time just for about one more question or so before we wrap up. And so, we get at the risk again of going, just at the strong leader philosophy, but looking at Putin, and I'll give this to both of you. What do you think is driving him? And then looking ahead, what does the future of Russia look like beyond Putin? Is that something that has crossed your minds? I mean, obviously he's relatively young and healthy, but is there a future beyond Putinism? Ambassador Vershbow, why don't I start with you?
Okay. Well, this could be the subject of a whole another webinar. First of all, I think there is hope. I'm always hopeful about the future, that leaders who understand the contradictions that are building up in the Putin system and contributing to this serious economic stagnation and international isolation. Such leaders may choose a more constructive, more cooperative course with the United States and its allies, and we should do everything we can, even in these sort of more difficult times, to hold that out as our goal. I think Putin is seized first and foremost about keeping his regime intact and keeping the opposition from developing. He's quite paranoid about street demonstrations leading to revolutions. And so I think that's his overarching priority. But he does want to make Russia a great power again and generate more respect, as he defines it, from the international community. I think there are ways that we can address that while staying firm on some principled issues relating to not changing borders by force, as the Russians have done in Ukraine, or taking more responsibility for some of the actions by their hackers than they've been willing to do today. Just a couple examples. Anyways, it's a big question. It's a big agenda, but we should try to diffuse tensions, stabilize the relationship as much as we can, and sort of plant seeds, at least, for a better future relationship down the road.
I agree with Ambassador Vershbow on that last part. I think it's important to remember how Putin came to power. We talked about that. I think, the country, there was 85% poverty. The nukes were not being protected as they might. It was a crisis. He's overstayed his time. He gave his Medvedev a kind of dress rehearsal. It didn't work out. I think he's probably seeking a way forward. I do think if there's escalating tension between Russia, the United States, that you could have more nationalist forces. I think power is overascribed to Putin. If there's some surveys showing how many of his orders are actually fulfilled, at 43%, I think there's more power dispersed in the country than we know, the regional powers. And so change may come from there. That's always been a possibility. But I think more Cold War is going to breed more nationalism. And that is not just in Russia. We have our own problems with American, hyper-nationalism, right-wing. My memory is January 6th, not to be too political, there were no Russians, Iranians, or Chinese running around the halls of our Congress. So I think we need to keep our eyes on the ball here and work as we can with Russia, with the world community. And I take one issue with Ambassador Vershbow. I don't think Russia is isolated. I think it's finding its way in other areas, but it would be better if there was more cooperation and dialogue and diplomacy and restraint.
On that note, thank you both. For those of you who've listened this whole time, there's obviously this idea of pursuing predictability and stability is, I think, as this discussion shows, going to be quite difficult. There's such a range of views, both in the chat boxes that we've seen from participants in the Q&A box and in our panelists. Clearly, I think the Biden administration's goal is a good one, but I think it, as we've seen today, it might be quite a challenge. But I want to thank both of you, Ambassador Vershbow, Katrina, both for the work that you do and for coming and sharing your views with us today. I think just getting a chance to see the difference of views is quite enlightening. So thank you very much. For those of you,
thank you.
Thank you. Our next briefing is Wednesday, October 27th. It will be 8 p.m. Eastern time. It's the last of our the Future of Democracy series, and it's about what matters more, democracy or economic growth. We have Professor Danny Kwa, who is at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore, and Dr. Larry Diamond at Stanford. So it should be a very interesting discussion. Thanks to everyone, and especially thank you to you, Katrina, and you, Ambassador Vershbow. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.